just a little bit across the border, but I don't know what y'all doing with the weather here in Indiana. Sunday, I am sweating. Last night, I get blown away in a hurricane. Today, you make me grab my jacket. I don't know what's going on, but I am very glad that I can be here. I had a wonderful meal at Tom and Colleen's house, wonderful food, wonderful conversation, and as much as I am enjoying preparing and presenting these lessons before you, I have been equally edified and enjoyed just the time that I can spend with some of you guys outside as well. And so I'm thankful that these relationships were able to be established this week. So, historians agree that a man named Jesus of Nazareth existed. There are people who claim he was a made-up individual, but there's just too much historical evidence to take those people seriously. As we saw last night, historians can point to things. They can prove that around 2,000 years ago, this was a real man in history. And not only that, but they can prove that he was thought of as a wise teacher that had a lot of followers. And records indicate that he was indeed crucified by the Roman government, and that after his death, his followers continued in his teachings and indeed even grew in number. That is history. Now, why the followers of Jesus remained faithful and why they spread his teachings, well, that was for one reason and one reason only. They believed he was the Son of God and the prophesied Messiah. And there were a lot of different reasons why they believed that, but there was one thing that clinched that for so many people. One thing that happened that they loudly proclaimed to all that would hear. And that is that Jesus rose from the dead. Amen. They believed that they believed that so that after he died, his body disappeared. And it was later seen alive by hundreds of people. And I think that of all the claims of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus is the one that gets attacked the most. It is the thing that atheists and non-believers will say is completely impossible. Deniers of the resurrection will attack this from many, many different angles. More than his birth, more than the miracles he performed, it is the resurrection that is attacked most often. And there is one reason for that as well. It's because everything about Christianity hinges on the resurrection. The resurrection is the key event in the whole Bible story. Everything before the resurrection, the Old Testament, the Gospels, they point up to the resurrection. Everything after the resurrection points back to the resurrection. It is the key to our faith. It is the linchpin. Even the Apostle Paul said that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he said, "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." If you call yourself a Christian, but you doubt the resurrection, I'm not sure how you can call yourself a Christian. If there's no resurrection, then Paul flat out says that faith is useless. So, it's not surprising that there are many, many, many theories about why it didn't happen. Because if people can dismantle the resurrection, if people can prove that it didn't happen, then they can dismantle all of Christianity. And as I said, I don't want our young people to be exposed to these arguments for the first time when we are not around. I want the church to show it to them. I want to be there when my children see these arguments and these debates for the first time. So please don't assume that if they have a question that they are going to come to you. Because trust me, the theories against God and the resurrection are going to come find them. As I said last night, we're not going to be able to cover all of the theories about how Jesus could not have really been raised from the dead. That's why we're actually spending 2 nights on this subject. There are a lot of arguments, but that is not because the Bible story is so full of holes. It's because every time an argument came up, it was answered. And so somebody had to come up with a new one. Also, as I said last night, if you consider yourself an agnostic or an atheist, there probably won't be one argument that's going to convince you. However, when you look at each individual argument and the logical conclusion that you can draw from that, you get one piece of the puzzle. And as you get more and more pieces of the puzzle, there is an answer that becomes obvious. Every time you come to a logical conclusion about one of these debates, does it seem to move you closer to the impossibility of the resurrection or the inevitability that it actually happened? Now, many people are going to tell you that based on human logic, the resurrection makes no sense. When you apply cold, hard logic to the event, it just doesn't fit. Well, I would argue that without the resurrection, there are some things that don't seem to fit or make sense in history. Without the resurrection, there are 2,000 years of history begging for an explanation. It's like a movie missing that key scene. No other event in all recorded history has reached so far across national, ethnic, religious, linguistic, cultural, political, or geographical borders. After the death of Jesus, within a couple months, there were thousands in and around Jerusalem that became his disciples. Within a couple of centuries, there were hundreds of thousands in the Mediterranean region that called themselves Christians or followers of Christ. In 325 AD, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And within 500 years, Greek temples to pagan gods were being converted into Christian churches all over the Roman world. Historian Philip Schaff described the overwhelming influence that Jesus had on history and culture all over the world for the past 2,000 years. He said, "This Jesus of Nazareth, without money or arms, conquered more millions than Alexander, Caesar, Muhammad, and Napoleon. Without science, he shed more light on things human and divine than all philosophers and scholars combined. Without the eloquence of schools, he spoke such words of life as were never spoken before or since, and produced effects which lie beyond the reach of orator or poet. Without writing a single line, he set more pens in motion and furnished themes for more sermons, orations, discussions, learned volumes, works of art, and songs of praise than the whole army of great men of ancient and modern times." Guys, the past 2,000 years of human history have been built around Jesus Christ. Also, I want you to think about this. Without the resurrection, why did the day of worship change? Following the resurrection, thousands of Jews practically overnight abandoned the century-old tradition of celebrating the Sabbath on the last day of the week and began worshiping on the first day of the week. Why? It's because they said that that was the day on which Christ beat death, sealing a new and final covenant with God. Do you think something that culturally significant would have happened so broadly and quickly without a really good reason? All of this just seems to be an amazing amount of world-altering change for something that did not or could not have happened. But what if it was all made up, okay? If it was all made up, if it's not real, then I'm not sure why the story they created caught on as the truth. Because the accounts of the resurrection include several inconvenient and unflattering details. They don't fit the expectation of a fabricated account. For example, women are the first witnesses of the resurrection. All four Gospels tell us that women were the first visitors to the empty tomb and were the first ones to learn about the resurrection. But in these ancient times, women were not considered reliable witnesses in court. What writer at that time would be making up a story he wanted people to believe and claim that women discovered Christ first, rather than saying, yes, we manly men found the empty tomb and announced the glorious resurrection of our Savior to the whole world? Instead, it was the ladies who found him first. Who would have made that up at this time? Likewise, all of the disciples, all of the leaders of the early church, they're kind of recorded as cowards when Jesus is taken. If I were Peter, making up a story where I wanted to have power over people, I would have probably not included things like I denied Jesus 3 times, or that later on in Galatians chapter 2, Paul had to come and get on to me because I was succumbing to peer pressure. There are just some details that don't seem to fit with a made-up story. Like we said, the message spread with unreasonable success across the world. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because, once again, history records this as kind of being abnormal. During the first few centuries, it spread without any political or military power. It prevailed against ruthless efforts of dedicated, organized, and violent opposition. How did a small band of disempowered Jews in an occupied and insignificant territory of ancient Rome accomplish this? What happened so many years ago that reframed all of human history? After Jesus' violent death, his followers were frightened and scattered. And then something happened that grew strong, bold, and confident belief that resisted sustained, murderous opposition. Unlike other movements where they had executed leaders, when they did come back together, they didn't replace Jesus with one of his family members. Their resistance was entirely nonviolent, devoid of political power, and yet they all suddenly were willing to die for what they said they saw. The day of Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples were devastated and in hiding. And then a short time later, they were willing to give their lives to tell Jesus' story to the world. Something happened. Also, skeptics and enemies were transformed. Jesus' little brother James didn't think anything about Jesus when they were growing up, because it makes sense. You don't think your siblings are all that special. I mean, John tells us, for not even his brothers believed him. Christ was crucified with James not believing anything about his older brother. But later on, something happened to James, to where not only did he believe, but he became an elder of the church in Jerusalem and died as a martyr in 62 AD. Oh, let's not even start talking about Saul of Tarsus. He was the chief prosecutor of early Christians. He dragged people to prison when they did not renounce their faith. He was a party to their execution. But something happened to him, and he was transformed from Saul, the enemy of Christianity, to Paul, the main writer about it. He left his position of prestige in Jewish society to become a traveling missionary who experienced incredible suffering in order to share the love of Christ throughout the Roman Empire. He too died for his faith. So again, we got to ask the question, what changed them? The Roman governor, Plinius Secundus, wrote in the 1st century that Christians were people who loved the truth at any cost. And although he was ordered to torture and execute them for refusing to curse Jesus, he was continually amazed by them. He was continually impressed with their firm commitments not to do any wicked deeds, never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, not to deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. So, if the disciples made up the claim that Jesus rose from the dead and then began to spread this false message wherever they went, if they knew it was a lie, what did they gain? They didn't get any money. They didn't get any power or glory. It certainly didn't make their life easier. Something significant changed them. Something they believed to be true beyond a shadow of a doubt. They said it was because the tomb was empty. They said it was because Jesus died and rose again 3 days later. So, let's talk about that now for a little while. Let's get into some of the specifics of that day, and let's talk about some of the days that followed. Let's talk about what could have happened and what could not have happened. First of all, there was an empty tomb. The Bible clearly states that there was no corpse there. Luke chapter 24, but on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And Jesus' enemies also confirmed that it was empty. In Matthew chapter 28, it says, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Why would they bribe the soldiers if the body was there? So, there was no body afterwards. There was no corpse. Well, what happened before? How did the body go in? Was it easy to get to? What preparations were made? Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 59. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. As verse says, this was a new tomb. You know what that means? Due to the nature of the ground and the geography of the land, they didn't bury people in the ground. It was just too hard to dig a 6-foot hole to have people in that time and in that land. What they did was they carved a tomb into a rock. It was essentially a cave. Pretty much people were buried in caves back then. And the fact that this was a new tomb meant that it was freshly carved. There was only one way in, and there was only one way out. And a new tomb also meant that there were no other bodies buried in there. Often, multiple people were buried in the same tomb. But since there was a new tomb, Jesus was the first and only one in there. It would have been hard to misplace the body. It was the only one in there. There were no other exits, and there were no other bodies. Also, it was covered with a stone door. Now, most scholars put the weight of the stone at about 2 tons. We're talking 4,000 pounds, and it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall, just a little bit taller than I am. Y'all didn't have to laugh so hard at that. But this was not something that was going to be moved by 1 or 2 men. But you know what? That's not all. Because the Romans made some preparations themselves. Matthew chapter 27 and verse 66 says, "So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard." The tomb had a Roman seal on it. Now, so across the tomb, across the door, going across it, there was a rope. Sometimes it was a ribbon, and it was together, and they put big sticks of clay on either side to hold it there in place. And in that clay, they punched a Roman seal. Probably looked something like this. And that seal was a clear sign to everybody that saw it. You break the seal, you break the law. You break the law, you die. But they even took it one step further because the tomb was guarded. At least 4 highly trained soldiers stood outside the tomb. Roman soldiers were experts in torture and in combat and not easily frightened off by a band of fishermen and tax collectors. Had they fallen asleep, had they left their post, they would have violated the law. And we know what happens when you violate the law. These soldiers would have violated, they would have executed themselves. They would have resulted in their own execution. And remember when the chief priests told them to lie about the body being stolen? They were essentially telling the soldiers to lie in such a way where they were going to get themselves killed. No Roman soldier was going to let a Jewish priest get him killed. And still, the tomb was empty. So, really now, come on. What happened to the body? The dead body of Jesus could not be found. So what happened to it? Well, I suggest to you that there are really only 4 possible accounts for what happened to the body. We'll talk about which is most likely. Sometimes you will hear that the enemies stole the body. This is actually a theory that some have put forth, but this one just seems crazy to me, to tell you the truth. If they did steal the body, they never claimed to have stolen the body. Jesus was killed because these people were worried about his influence and the spread of his teaching. They knew he said he was going to come back from the dead. Why would they do anything to support this claim? And that doesn't even fit the gospel narrative either. In Matthew chapter 27, it says the next day, that is after the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell people, 'He has risen from the dead,' and the last fraud will be worse than the first." And Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. This took place before Jesus went into the tomb because they were worried about the disciples stealing the body and claiming that Jesus came back. They did not want this to happen. So the idea that they stole the body is just ludicrous to me. If they had the body, surely they would have produced it to stop the spread of Christianity in the very city where he was executed. Imagine if that had happened. "Oh, Jesus has come back from the dead. He's come back from the dead." No, he didn't. "No, yeah, how do you know?" "Voila, here's the body." They didn't do that. That didn't happen. Well, the one you will hear the most often, the one that the enemies were worried about, was that his friends stole the body. That's the most common argument. It was the one that the authorities were scared of. We spent a whole lot of time talking about the precautions that they took to make sure that this particular thing didn't happen. So, does that seem probable? Could they have snuck in under the cover of night, overcome the guards at the tomb, quietly rolled away a 2-ton stone, and snuck off with a corpse in such an effective way that nobody ever knew about it? And beyond that, would they have begun to preach with such authority that Jesus was raised knowing that he was not? Would they have risked their lives and accepted beatings for something they knew was a fraud? And I'll tell you, all of this is really, 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 really interesting, and it's a much deeper discussion, and we're going to talk about that one more tomorrow night, so I hope you can come back. But for 40 years, the disciples that were there at the resurrection never changed their stories, even when it cost them their lives. None of them ever admitted to a conspiracy, even under torture. Sometimes you might hear this one: Jesus was not dead, but only unconscious. Even the enemies of Jesus didn't try this line. The torture and blood loss that he endured before and during the crucifixion, that stuff was designed to kill. The Romans saw to that. They were very good at their jobs. They were experienced in this execution, and they knew a dead body when they saw one. Sometimes, to speed up the process, the legs of the victims would be broken. If a person was dead, no reason to break the legs. If they were still alive, then they broke the legs to kill them that much quicker. It was an evaluation that was made by Roman soldiers all the time. What does John 19 tell us? So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. The Roman soldiers were probably well acquainted with dead bodies and could tell if someone was alive or not. Jesus was dead, and they still stuck him with a spear. But for the sake of argument, let's say that somehow Jesus was still alive. He did receive all of that damage to his body and received no medical attention. Somehow, He woke up. First, I think it's crazy. He woke up and broke out of the bandages. Have you ever fallen asleep in the morning and you got all tangled up in your covers and you couldn't get out? That was you after a full night of rest and fully healthy. The fact that he woke up and broke out of the bandages is the most amazing thing to me, but still, somehow, he awoke, he broke out of the bandages, removed the stone, overcame the soldiers, and vanished from history after a few meetings with his disciples in which he convinced them that he was risen from the dead. If that is your argument, then I think you are in fact calling him superhuman. So, after all of that, what's left? What is the only logical explanation left for what happened to the body? I think we know. Guys, the resurrection was real. It happened just like the disciples said it did. It happened just like Jesus said it would. It happened just like the prophet said it would. It happened just like God planned before time began. Now, tomorrow, we are going to continue to talk about this. Because if there's someone here that does have doubts, it can be a really scary thing. I get that. I don't expect someone to totally turn their life around after one sermon. But I want to give you some things to seriously think about. Some things to seriously consider. I want to give you some more stuff to think about tomorrow. And I hope that you will be here. But right now, tonight, if you do believe that the resurrection is true, then that means you can also believe what Peter said and that it is true as well. 1 Peter 1:3 says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." Peter says, because Jesus was resurrected, we can have this living hope that God is going to raise us to. But it is only going to be through Jesus Christ. We go through a resurrection when we die in the waters of baptism and come up in a new life. When we are baptized, we go into a death like his, and we are resurrected like his. You ever remember he talks about putting to death that old man of sin, that old person that you used to be, that person is dead. And you come up out of that water a new person, clothed in Christ. You ain't gonna be exactly like Christ. But every day you're trying a little bit more to be more like him. The two biggest mistakes, the two biggest misconceptions that I think people have when they're thinking about baptism is some of them say, well, I'm not good enough yet to be baptized. Guys, nobody is. You will never get good enough to be baptized. If you could, you wouldn't need to be baptized. And the other mistake that people make is they think, I won't be able to stay good enough after I'm baptized. We're all going to mess up. Guys, we are all just a hot mess 3 days out of the week. But when we've come up out of that water, we've established a relationship with Christ. And it is that relationship that allows him to hear my prayers when I say, God, I'm sorry, I did it again. please forgive me. And he will. But if I have not died with him, then I can't be reborn with him, and I can't have that resurrection like Peter promised. So if you are ready to put to death that old man of sin, and like I said, it says we got to put him to death. Too many times we've got the old man of sin over on life support in case we need him again later on. We're supposed to put him to death. And if you're ready to do that, you can. If you're here tonight and you feel compelled to do something to get yourself right with God, then you can come forward tonight while we stand and while we sing.